Is the sound all right? Okay. No? This darn thing. What?
He said he was going to give Parliament the right to a free vote. And then he explained what he meant by a free vote.
You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters?
Ed Turner, just one second.
Once any
You
nation,
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Just watch me.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Tony Blair and Mr. Christopher Hitchens.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Red Ensign Special, series of videos where we address in detail a specific topic. In this case, for the first time, I will directly respond to another creator in this intellectual space. Academic Agent has recorded a series of videos called Neema Parvini versus the Right Wing, where he takes on right-wing ideas and attempts to posit proper arguments against them. The video that I'm going to concern myself with here is Neema Parvini versus right-wing ideas number 6, the declining birth rate. In my view, this is an uncharacteristically poor framing of a very complex issue. We're going to do a couple of things here. We're going to look at the arguments Parvini presents. We're going to then try to get a picture of actual historic birth rate trends and population trends over time. And then we're going to present an argument for how I think the situation should be framed and understood. So without further ado, let's let Mr. Parvini speak for himself.
Those decrying the declining birth rate, and by declining birth rate I'm talking about global birth rate, but also birth rate in the West as well, but it's declining all around the world, especially in the developed parts of the world. They tend to have 3 flavors, okay? So the first flavor is the Elon Musk style, where he worries about growth for his capitalist schemes, okay? Second, there is the Christian style concern, where they simply believe more people equals God's will or God's good or whatever. More people equals good, equals God, more believers, whatever it is, or whatever the Christian justification for it is, they want more people, okay? Third style, where they worry specifically about white births compared to all other demographics.
Okay, so you can see here the gist of the video. He presents 3 arguments that come broadly from the right. He fairly and accurately characterizes these arguments. The first argument is the kind of more people, more GDP, more good argument. You see this very often from the tech right. Elon Musk is the big champion. But there's kind of 2 unspoken elements to this this argument. The first unspoken element to this argument is that the political formula of the global American empire is predicated on increasing populations. It's full of these embedded growth obligations that, if you fail to realize, damage the credibility of the system. Parvini is attacking this argument because he correctly intuits that the correct mechanism to subvert the global American empire is to break out of this frame and say, actually, no, I'm not going to solve your problem for you. So that's the first argument he takes on. The second argument is a vague cluster of Christian arguments. I don't blame Parvini for this characterization because there's a lot of different flavors of argument made from Christians as to why higher birth rates are good. And so he's not incorrect to kind of vaguely associate the group and a cluster of non-specific arguments. And then the third argument is the kind of ethno-nationalist argument that says if my group should be bigger than your group, my group should have a greater share of the future. So we got 3 arguments that I think share, and by my group, they mean white people typically. We have three arguments that share one common bad framing, in my opinion. In my opinion, there is no such thing as global birth rate because there is no such thing as global community or global governance. There's only specific governance of specific people. There's a bond between a leader and a group of followers, however large that group of followers is. There are only specific people. There is no one common humanity. I think it's worth at this juncture taking a step back and having a look at some of Parvini's factual claims, and then coming back to why I think this is a bad framing, how I think it should be framed instead, and what the consequences of an alternative framing would be for how we thought about this issue. Okay, so let's just play a little bit more of Parvini in his own words, and then I will respond to it.
Europe conquered the globe with a fraction of its current. If every country has a declining birth rate, if you just allow the excess population on top to die, every nation will be in the same boat. So relatively speaking, nobody will be worse. Okay,
so Parvini here is pointing to population dynamics as a feature of geopolitics. So he points out that having a larger population doesn't necessarily mean that you will geopolitically outcompete your rival. He also points out that that if there's a common trend among all nations of the world, then that trend can be allowed to run to its conclusion without conferring a specific advantage to any particular group. Right? This is a way to address the kind of white nationalist claim that this is the dissolution of their people, broadly speaking. Now, let's have a look at actual demographic history here and trends, because I think the way he's posited this is not quite accurate. So, in the year 1000, Europeans represented 15% of global population. In the year 1700, they represented 21% of global population. This level actually peaked in the year 1950, when Europeans represented 25% of global population. And interestingly, for the purpose of this argument, rapidly declined, so that by 1972, even though there were more people in Europe as a fraction of global population, they had declined to just 18%. So very radical change very rapidly as a consequence of the population explosion, primarily in Asia at that time. So demographic trends of this kind are local. They're not global. So in the period between 1000 and 1700, the demographic trends in Europe diverged sharply from the demographic trends in the rest of the world, leading to a larger population. That period of relative population expansion coincided with the relative increase in geopolitical power out of Europe. So it's true that there isn't a one-to-one relationship between number of people and the geopolitical success of any given group of people. But it's also true that the geopolitical success of a group of people is strongly linked to their demographic success. So a group of people which is geopolitically successful is likely to be demographically successful. A group of people that is demographically unsuccessful is likely to be geopolitically unsuccessful as well. So these two things are linked in a way that the proposition that that Europeans were always a minority, both during periods where they were not in a position of geopolitical dominance and in periods where they were in a geopolitical position of dominance, I think that framing here tries to kind of hand wave away this link. And this link can be seen among various groups through history. Equally, the idea that demographic trends are in common across the globe, particularly the trend toward reduced birth rates is in common across the world, I think is just not factually correct. And one of the strange features of modernity is that it's seen very rapid, very substantial shifts in the relative size of demographics in various regions. So we talked about the population explosion in Asia in the post-war period. There are a couple of factors to this. One factor to this is the widespread adoption of anti-malarial measures, whether they're pharmacological or whether they're through the use of pesticides, dramatically increased the carrying capacity of South Asia, so that even despite the massive famines that occurred through the region and the kind of ravages of communism that occurred in the post-war period, still you saw a massive demographic increase throughout the region because of this effective increase in carrying capacity. So you see these kinds of shifts pretty frequently. And if we move this forward, you'll see a comparable shift in the African population, big second derivative change coming in the 60s, so that you can see the share of global population, which is African, is now something like twice the share, which is European, whereas the opposite was true in 1950. So these kinds of changes do happen. They have happened frequently in modernity for a variety of reasons, and they have dramatic consequences. A lot of the migration waves that are driven out of Africa are a direct consequence of this period of very high fertility, beginning in maybe 1960 and continuing on to today. The other claim here that I think is really worth addressing and dismissing, because it's incredibly common, is that fertility trends are downward everywhere in the world, and quote unquote, especially in the developed world. This is not exactly true. So what we're looking at here is a historical chart of the TFR of the United Kingdom, 1800 to today. There are a couple of things that I want to draw the audience's attention to. First, that the decline in TFR that was experienced in the United Kingdom overwhelmingly occurred between 1880 and 1930, and not in the sort of post-war era as a consequence of birth control or whatever else, right? The TFR changes in the United Kingdom, whatever they were caused by, well, we can discuss what they were caused by, but they're not associated with the kind of with post-industrial Britain. They're not associated with the modern period really at all. They're associated with the late British imperial period. And the fertility rate in the United Kingdom has actually been pretty stable since about 1935, with this interruption in the post-war period, right? The thing which is easy to explain is TFR decreases due to urbanization and deracination and irreligiosity. The thing that is difficult to explain is the post-war population boom. This is why so much sociology in this area is just kind of nonsense, because they start the data set sometime in the post-war period, or they explain the population decline in the pre-war period as a consequence of the war and the social dislocations of the war, when in reality, the population, the fertility declines in the 30s are really prior to the war, and actually they stabilized during the war. So they're not a consequence of the dislocations associated with the war. They're a consequence of something quite different. The aberration is the post-war period. The trend is stabilized from the 30s and is very, very consistent since then. We're looking at the United Kingdom. We could look at a dozen different Western countries and see fundamentally the same picture, that the demographic transition occurs as a result of the rural to urban migration associated with the late 19th and very early 20th century, and that TFR through these countries has actually been relatively stable since then, with this exception of the post-war moment that, you know, all our parents thought was normal, but was definitely not normal. By contrast, throughout the developing world, the third world, you see a very different trend. So this is TFR data from Papua New Guinea. You see a different trend where the fertility rate has consistently declined since the 1970s, without interruption and without break in trend. So in actual fact, the decline in birth rate is not centered in the developed world, but in the developing and undeveloped world, right? The big declines in global birth rate that are going to cause the peak of global population are not as a consequence of Western industrial countries. They're as a consequence of the collapse of fertility in countries which are not industrialized. Places like Vietnam, places like India, places like Indonesia, places like Iran. This is an important piece of information to know about the kind of factual landscape into which we're speaking. It's true that today the map of fertility has many underdeveloped countries still with fertility rates in substantial excess of fertility rates in the Western world, which means that the share of population associated with these countries will continue to increase relative to Europe and North America. However, while fertility rates are relatively stable in North America and Europe, they are rapidly declining throughout the third world, and interestingly, also in Southeast Asia. Okay, so what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the future demographic distribution of the planet is going to be quite different than it is today, as long as current trends hold, which is indicative historically of a movement of geopolitical power away from the West and towards some of these countries, and interestingly, away from China as well, towards a truly different future. Now, it may be that that the trend which held through the sort of second millennium AD does not hold in the future. It's hard to say, but that is the demographic trend which exists. Okay, so that's the factual landscape. Now, I want to let Dr. Parvini speak in his own words here for a minute, and then I want to talk about how I think this should be reframed.
During the Black Death, the English population halved, but wage rates doubled. It's still one of the biggest jumps in wage rates on record.
Okay, so this is a really straightforward and fundamentally correct argument. So historically, there have been a number of negative disruptions in population. The Black Death in England is probably the best documented example in history. And negative disruptions due to disease and population usually result in positive wage changes. So wages for the lower and middle class tend to go up, and often are associated with periods of prosperity in the following years. there are a couple of comments that I would have here. First, population disruptions associated with disease, like the Black Death, are fundamentally different than population disruptions associated with the changes in fertility. And here's why. When a serious illness passes through the population, it tends to eliminate the unfit. So that's the elderly, that's those who have chronic health problems of various kinds. That's in some cases, it's babies as well. But fundamentally, you end up with a population after the event which is younger and healthier than the population which existed before the event, and a population which is less burdened with dependents, both young and old, than the population before the event. It's therefore not surprising that the per capita economic performance of the state afterwards is much better, right? They're relieved of the burden of the elderly, they're relieved of the burden of young children, and they're relieved of the burden of the sick. And the piece of the population which is left is healthier and stronger than the aggregate average prior to the event. You should expect prosperity to follow that, assuming that group competition doesn't cause a problem. So the statement he offers is correct, and in like a number of ways. The problem is that's not the kind of change that we're seeing in the modern world. Population changes as a result in declining fertility don't leave younger, healthier, stronger, less burdened populations behind. Instead, they leave older and much more burdened populations in their place, right? So we have a situation where declining fertility leads to much larger shares of the population being old as opposed to young. And so the population in their active working years becomes burdened down with the need to care for these older people. These older people tend to be much less healthy. And so there's that aspect to the burden of care as well. And these older populations tend to be asset accumulators and tend to accumulate a disproportionate share of political power in the country and drive stagnation. You might imagine that, imagine the vibe of a country dominated by young people as kind of in keeping with the character of young people. They're excitable, the horizons are infinite in their mind. They have a frame of mind and a way of being which sees the future. Whereas if you imagine a country politically dominated by the old folks' home, it's dominated by care, harm, morality. It's dominated by risk aversion. It tends to be very conservative of the order as it is. And it tends to have very, very, very little thought for time horizons beyond the next decade or two. I hope we're all recognizing a pattern here that might match our current political situation. So it's not true that demographics are determinative of politics and society, but they certainly have an influence. And certainly if you had to choose between a young and dynamic population and an old and causative population, that choice kind of makes itself. Now, that's wages, that's the kind of dynamics of a population that has suffered a disruption. Parvini then goes on to make a broader point about living standards. And that point about living standards, I think, is complex and nuanced. So he talks about the availability of assets compared to the number of people competing for assets. And he suggests that lower population densities lead to a greater availability of resources per person. Now, it's very difficult to assess this argument because there's very little data to ride on, except that at an intuitive level, a huge fraction of the resources that exist in our world are not labor input dependent. That is to say, the experiment of adding population to Western countries, or even adding population, this is a picture of Cairo, which has these immense blocks where human beings are essentially warehoused. There's something like 20 million people in Cairo. There's no productive industry in Cairo of any consequence. If you eliminated Cairo from the history of the world for the last 100 years, almost nothing will have changed, right? It doesn't provide anything. It is a warehouse of humanity with no telos, particularly, except maybe the raising of Islamic prayers. This is, and not only that, the people who live there live in this kind of absolute misery, in part, it must be said, because of the crowding. They live stacked on top of each other in these tiny concrete boxes. This is not how mankind was meant to live. And so, in a sense here, Parvini is correct that population density is a form of reduction in standard of living, and that these dense blocks of migrant populations are resource consumers and not providers of resources. You can see this in Canada as a great example. If you were to look at the fundamental economic productivity of Canada, you would see it distributed across the regions in kind of an interesting way. The mining industry is incredibly productive and is very spread over the country. The oil industry is very productive and is concentrated in a couple of regions. The agricultural industry is extremely geographically spread and extremely productive. The forestry industry is extremely geographically spread and extremely productive. But the population, and particularly the population increases that have occurred in conjunction with modernity, are concentrated in these hubs of unproductivity, right? Just like Cairo, all through the Western world, there are these endless barrackses of subsidized service sector workers, right? If you look at the TFR migration to Canada during COVID, overwhelmingly it came to the big cities. Overwhelmingly it came in the form of service workers who are net tax burdens on society, and overwhelmingly they're subsidized in order to keep the price of a Starbucks low, right? So that the professional managerial class who are in control of the politics of the country can continue to have the same standard of living driven by the service economy, by driving down the wages of service workers. That's the story of the early 21st century, driving down the wages of service workers in order to allow these people to maintain their sort of upper middle class pretenses at the cost of the aggregate health of the nation as a whole. So it's not incorrect to say that if you simply eliminated these people, the fundamental infrastructure that exists in places like Canada or the United Kingdom, which was designed for much smaller populations, would be relieved of tremendous strain, and the productivity in terms of real goods of the nations in question would be much higher. That said, the idea that this is a consequence of high fertility, I think, misunderstands the situation. If you look at the history of Canada, it is a unique feature of the late 20th and early 21st century that migration is focused on urban areas and the service economy. Through most of Canada's history, population growth and migration tended to be associated with the productive industries of the country and the productive centers of the country wherever they were, whether it be in the industrial area in the cities and sort of 1900 to 1950, or whether it be in earlier areas where the agricultural sector of the country was developed, or where the mining sector of the country was developed, or when the population shifted out west to take advantage of the oil discoveries in the latter half of the 20th century. Outside of this kind of narrow envelope, population growth and population migration tended to be associated with productive tasks rather than this kind of service industry nonsense designed to prop up standards of living for a narrow segment of society. Equally, you'll see when you look at this population density map of the country that the country is by no means full. And the conditions of population density in which these people live are entirely constructed. So you could imagine population growth in which this kind of urban barracksing of service workers was not the dominant mode. The character of the growth that you see is a direct consequence of the political control of the elites that currently operate the system. Okay, so that kind of gives you a sense of what I think of the arguments as presented by Parvini. It's very much a mixed bag. He makes good arguments. He presents facts in ways that I think are somewhat misleading. But I think the actual problem here is that the arguments are framed incorrectly. They're framed on the idea that population is a consequence of elite policy decided globally and operates globally. I would instead say that when you speak about TFR and you speak about population dynamics in this intellectual space, you're actually speaking to a very specific group of people, and that the instructions on what you should do should be predicated on speaking to a particular group of people. You as a leader of your particular community have an obligation to try to maximize the piece of the future that group of people might claim. All right. The choice not to have children is a way to guarantee that you do not grab a piece of that future on behalf of that group. On the other hand, the choice to make your group a dynamic group grabbing a larger share of the future than other groups is a choice associated with effective leadership of your community, right? The global population trends belong to God, and they're very much outside your control. The global American empire is not going to be in your control at any time in the foreseeable future. If you were sitting in Elon Musk's chair as an elite associated with that empire, it might be in your interest to try to increase fertility trends across that empire. But we're not going to be sitting there anytime in the foreseeable future. And so I think framing the issue in that way is very foolish. Instead, what you're speaking to is these tiny little subcommunities of people, some of whom you're already in a position of leadership, some with respect to, some of which you're bidding for a position of leadership with respect to. And I would suggest that a policy that promoting antinatalism among your own group is kind of deeply self-defeating. It's encouraging antisocial tendencies in them. It's encouraging the creation of this kind of longhouse dominated by the desire for comfort of the older class. Having more children than you can simply pass your current assets to keep in lifestyle is a way of driving people towards achievement and towards accomplishment. And so I think when you turn the issue from what should the global population do to what should the people that I have influence over do, the answer becomes quite trivial. The people you have influence over should maximize the piece of the future that they grab. For most people, that means having children at above replacement rates. For most people, their lives will be tremendously positively transformed by the experience of having children. It's an incredible blessing from God. For most people, that means the embrace of the difficult task of building the future on behalf of those children. Equally, I think you're fundamentally disqualified from political leadership if you don't own a piece of that future. You should this is part of the argument that I have made repeatedly, that elites should be bound to their group, both territorially and in terms of their kind of vision of their own prospects and the prospects for their children, right? The more that the elite that you follow as a group is divorced from your own prospects and their children are divorced from your own prospects, the more that they can make decisions that are horrendous and evil, and the more that they can walk away from their mistakes. Encouraging fertility as a social norm and encouraging fertility among the elites which lead your group will lead to a healthier dynamic and a stronger bond of future prospects together. The last thing that I will say here is that it's extremely likely that population declines are part of the future that is ahead of us. I don't think we should war too hard against that. We should simply say that tomorrow belongs to us because we're willing to take on the challenges required to seize it. Let me repeat that. Tomorrow belongs to those who are willing to take on the challenges, make the sacrifices in order to build that future for themselves and their children and their descendants for many generations off. You have a unique opportunity in this moment to seize that future, embrace it. Don't get caught up with whether or not there are too many people, whether the carrying capacity of the globe is too large. Nobody knows. So if we look at land under cultivation peaked in the late 50s, and yet global agricultural output has radically increased in the intervening years. So when you hear somebody like David Attenborough talk about how we're out of balance with the natural environment, you're just full of nonsense. We've not been taxing the natural environment more intensively. Like land use for agriculture is an excellent marker of how heavily we're taxing the natural resources around us. That level of taxation peaked in the 1950s. It hasn't increased since, and yet since the global population has more than tripled. Productivity in the agricultural sectors for staple crops, for livestock, is through the moon. So I don't know whether there are too many people or too few people. I know that there's a vast population devoid of telos, devoid of productivity, that exists in order to prop up the lifestyle of this useless managerial elite that runs the American empire. And I know that that's a terrible, terrible situation, but I decline to speculate on whether there should be 1 billion people, 100 million people, 10 billion people. That's not in my hands. That's in the hands of God. What's in my hands is whether or not the group of people who I lead are going to seize the future. Having children is part of seizing the future. It's not all of seizing the future. There are people who will be called not to embrace it for various reasons. But that future is open. It's available to anyone who wants to grab it. Don't let yourself be propagandized into letting go of what could belong to you. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head.
a bunch of the boys was a whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.